We all kind of think we understand cyberbullying, right? We figure it's just trolls being trolls. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're taking a highly clinical, really fascinating look at this behavior through R.J. Starr's theoretical essay, The Psychology of the Cyberbully. And what is absolutely incredible here is that Starr doesn't frame this as some modern technological glitch or just a generic social problem. No, he frames it as a precise psychological mechanism. We're going to explore this behavior strictly as an attempt to stabilize an identity. It's really not about the platforms at all. It's entirely about the architecture of the person using them.
So here's our roadmap for deconstructing this. First, we'll look at the etiology, or the disempowerment condition. Second, the mechanism, how anonymity actually functions. Third, the prognosis, which is the developmental cost. And finally, number 4, the diagnosis.
All right, let's dive right into Part 1, Etiology, the disempowerment condition originating within the identity domain. According to R.J. Starr's psychological architecture framework, this whole behavior starts way before a phone or a keyboard is ever touched. It begins with something called chronic disempowerment. This is a persistent internal state where the self feels entirely without efficacy, without recognition, or the capacity to produce effects that register as meaningful. We aren't just talking about having a bad day at the office or getting frustrated in traffic. It's kind of like trying to drive a car with a permanently empty gas tank. It's this deep internal deficit where the individual just feels inherently insufficient. Now, it's absolutely crucial that we separate this internal feeling from the outside world. Chronic disempowerment is entirely different from material powerlessness. You could have a totally functional life on paper, a successful job, money, relationships, and still suffer from chronic disempowerment. Because it's not about lacking material resources. It's the absence of a stable, internal connection to those resources. The self essentially feels completely dependent on external inputs just to generate a fleeting, temporary feeling of adequacy.
Which leads us to this profound logic of substitution. Starr writes, "The attack is rewarding not despite accomplishing nothing, but because it accomplishes the one thing available to a self that has foreclosed the productive paths, it produces an effect." Just think about that for a second. When you feel like you can't build something up, what's the easiest alternative? Tearing something down. When someone literally cannot generate power through actual competence, contribution, or creation, they substitute destruction. It is a counterfeit form of agency. Damaging a business's rating or trying to ruin a person's reputation? For a self that has foreclosed productive paths, that's just the closest approximation they have to actually mattering in the world. That brings us to Part 2, Mechanism, the structure of anonymity and the removal of the regulatory brake.
So what does anonymity actually do here? Well, structurally, it removes social accountability. Under normal conditions, the fear of reputational damage or losing relationships acts as a brake on our aggressive impulses. Anonymity doesn't magically create the aggression out of thin air, it simply takes the brake off. It removes the mechanism that prevents exposure. The actor absolutely requires anonymity because the behavior itself simply cannot survive the light of day.
And this brilliantly illustrates the difference in intention between an anonymous actor and a public one. It's the difference between an act and a claim, or as Starr puts it, disposal versus expression. See, someone who attacks publicly using their real name is making a claim. They're invested in the content of their argument, and they're willing to absorb the social cost of defending it. But the anonymous individual, they make no such commitment. They are entirely invested in the act itself. They aren't trying to communicate a genuine position to you. They're just getting rid of something toxic.
The essay captures this dynamic perfectly with this quote: "The anonymous attack is not a form of expression, it is a form of disposal." Let that sink in. The target, whether it's a random stranger on the internet or a local restaurant down the street, is really just incidental. They are selected simply because they're available to act as a container. The attacker is just offloading a deeply uncomfortable psychological state that they cannot manage internally right onto someone else.
And this is a real game changer to understand, because the mechanism is structurally identical everywhere you go online. Look at consumer reviews. It's imposing damage on functional entities without any existing relationship. On forums, it's coordinated pile-ons using collective anonymity to somehow normalize the hostility. On social platforms, you have burner profiles redirecting that hostility while keeping the actors safely insulated. And in direct messaging, disappearing texts deliver an unlocatable impact, heavily intensifying that transfer of disempowerment. The technological infrastructure changes, sure, but the core psychological mechanism doesn't budge an inch.
So, where does this inevitably lead? Let's move to Part 3, Prognosis, the developmental cost and the structural failure of the behavior.
Here is exactly why this behavior structurally fails to provide the relief the actor is so desperately seeking. The attack addresses a symptom, not the origin. Damaging an incidental target cannot touch the internal deficit of personal power. The actor fully expects relief, but because their chronic disempowerment is an internal structural problem, the external attack doesn't actually fix it. The actor just crashes right back to their baseline state of disempowerment the very moment that temporary rush fades away.
It just becomes this completely regressive cycle. Every single time an anonymous attack happens, a choice is being made. They are choosing destruction over developing actual competence. They're picking immediate discharge over self-reflection, retaliation over emotional processing, and concealment over accountability. They aren't just failing to build adult psychological capacities like frustration tolerance and impulse control. They are actively practicing their exact opposites.
And this brings us to a really critical concept in the essay, the generalization argument. Let's trace this compounding cost step by step. Step 1 is immediate discharge. The actor uses the anonymous attack to quickly reduce their immediate internal discomfort. Step 2 is capacity atrophy. By constantly avoiding conflict navigation and real accountability, they actively weaken their own emotional regulation and frustration tolerance, which leads to Step 3, systemic migration. These deficits don't stay neatly contained in a browser window, no way. They bleed out into the person's real-life friendships, their romantic relationships, and their workplaces.
Starr emphasizes this generalization heavily, and the phrasing is perfect. Quote, "The individual who practices avoidance of accountability online is practicing avoidance of accountability. Full stop." The behavior isn't just failing to resolve their internal condition, it is progressively, systematically weakening the exact capacities they would need to ever actually overcome it. The damage isn't just a lack of progress, it's literal, cumulative decay.
Finally, let's look at Part 4, Diagnosis, the diagnostic frame, and anonymity as a confession. Ultimately, the essay arrives at this definitive, structural conclusion. The behavior is not merely a demonstration of the internal problem, it is an active training program for its continuation. What we're looking at is a portrait of a highly unstable identity. A stable identity can absorb the ordinary frictions of everyday life, but an unstable identity cannot. It requires constant external inputs, like approval, comparison, or in this specific case, attacking a target, just to generate a sensation of adequacy it cannot produce from within. This leaves us with a stark, genuinely clarifying reality. The target received an attack. The observer received a diagnosis. The anonymous attack is a highly legible signal. It precisely announces the brittleness of an identity that is completely unable to locate personal efficacy. The target is incidental, the platform is just a tool, but the anonymity? The anonymity is a confession. It tells you exactly what the attacker is working with internally. Now, this entire analysis is grounded in the identity domain of R.J. Starr's psychological architecture framework. If you want to explore the complete theoretical work, including this foundational essay, you definitely should check out profrjstarr.com. It is a fascinating, structural account of the human experience that completely reframes how we view our digital interactions. I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up. Does the mask simply conceal the individual, or does it perfectly reveal the architecture of a self entirely unable to tolerate its own inadequacy? Take a moment to really think about that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the structures behind the behavior, and I will see you next time.